Welcome back to another video, and if like myself you love doing drone photography and you own a DJI Air 3S, then I've got a little secret weapon that this drone has which no one really talks about, which will really transform your still photography. And that's the fact that this drone is an absolute long exposure animal. Seriously, it's extremely good. And in this video, I'm going to show you what led me to make such a bold claim. Then I'm going to share with you some of my top tips on how to take long exposures with drones, not just the Air 3S. And then I'm going to show you how you can go from boring hyperlapses like this into something a little bit more interesting and exciting like this by going old school and using long exposure shots. So let's get straight into it and let me show you why I think that this drone is just absolutely kick-ass when it comes to long exposures. Okay, so let's have a look at how the Air 3S stacks up against the mighty Mavic 3 Pro when it comes to long exposure photography. The Mavic 3 Pro is a bit of a long exposure beast already, so it'll be interesting how they stack up. So I'm going to fly them to the same location, take a handful of pictures, 5-second exposures, ND8 on both of these drones, and then we go back to the studio, have a look at those pictures, analyze them and see which one is better. Okay, so we've got 33 pictures taken with both drones simultaneously at the same location, same settings, and I've had a really close look at all those pictures and I've ranked them between 3 stages. Good, just about usable and okay, and unusable or very poor. And just to give you some examples of what that looks like, so this one is an example of a good picture, and we can zoom in on this, and if you look at this writing on the road there, it's all clear and readable. There's no ghosting, everything's sharp, everything looks quite good. Then we've got this one, which on the face of it looks quite decent, but if you zoom in, you can start to see a little bit of ghosting there if you compare it to the better one. And then to give you an example of a poor picture, we've got this one here, which has a lot of ghosting, a lot of camera movement. There's basically a double sign there where there should just be one, and this is almost unreadable. And the whole picture is actually looking a bit softer and less sharp. Okay, so let's have a look at how these two drones stacked up against each other. And starting off with the Mavic 3 Pro, we've had 17 pictures which were good, which for 5-second exposures in calm conditions is quite reasonable and pretty much what you can expect. I've had 11 pictures which were okay and just about usable, and 5 pictures were completely unusable. So that's pretty much a typical snapshot of what you can expect with the Mavic 3 Pro. And that is actually quite good. These are 5-second exposures. Expect that attrition rate to be a bit lower if you're taking longer exposures of 8 seconds, or if it's windy, or if your compass is not calibrated. Now looking at the Air 3S, this is what you get. 33 out of 33 pictures were all good. Every single picture taken with this drone at the same time was good. And I can show you some comparisons. So this is the Air 3S versus the Mavic 3 Pro. And again, Air 3S, Mavic 3 Pro. If you compare the two, you can see a clear difference in ghosting with the Mavic 3 Pro when you didn't get it with the Air 3S. And it doesn't just stop there. 8-second exposures with the Air 3S. I've done multiple ones of those. I'll show you some examples, but time after time after time in those conditions, absolutely no problem at all. Now, that length of exposure with a drone is actually quite a feat, and it's possible with the Mavic 3 Pro, and I've done it several times. But you have to take quite a few pictures and hope for the best, and then pick out the ones that the best out of those. But then to take it up another notch, we've got the 3x or 72mm lens on the Air 3S. And taking long exposure shots at high focal lengths is quite tricky with drones because any movement gets exaggerated and it gets quite difficult to avoid motion blur or camera movement. Now with the Mavic 3 Pro, you can just about do it sometimes. You have to take quite a few pictures and hope for the best. But with the Air 3S, I've taken multiple 8-second, this is 8-second exposures at 72mm, and almost every single one of those was fine, which is absolutely mind-boggling. I'll show you some examples. So we have this one here. There you go. This is an 8-second exposure, absolutely sharp and absolutely fine. And then we have this one here, which again is an 8-second exposure. We've got long light streaks there, lots of light movement, cars moving, and that picture is absolutely sharp and absolutely perfect. Okay, so there are some caveats that need to be mentioned when it comes to long exposures with the Air 3S. And the first one is that it's kind of cheating a little bit when it comes to long exposures, because at anything higher than 2-second exposures, it essentially uses something called simulated long exposure, I believe. And when it does that, it basically takes a series of pictures, stacks them, and creates a sort of simulated effect of a long exposure. And you can kind of see this in some images, because sometimes the downside with that is that light streaks have like a sort of a zigzaggy or intermittent shape to them. They're not one continuous streak. I can show you that here. So if we take a look at this picture, if we look at this streak up here, you can kind of see it's kind of intermitted a tiny bit. So it's almost like several lines joined together. And again on this one up here. And that effect kind of gets a bit worse when it gets windy because of camera movement. But in most cases, including this one, if you zoom out, you really can't notice that. And it's very, very subtle. But that's something worth mentioning, because with the Mavic 3 Pro, you have one continuous picture generating your 8-second exposure, if you use that kind of exposure time. With the Air 3S, if you do 8-second exposures, it'll essentially be multiple images and they're stacked together, and that's what you get. Okay, so the other caveat is if we take the Air 3S's good shots and we compare them against the Mavic 3 Pro's good shots, so the ones where the Mavic did nail it, the Mavic 3 Pro definitely still has the edge with just nicer, cleaner images, less chromatic aberration, more contrast. So the Mavic 3 Pro still has a better camera, but it'll take quite a few shots to get that sort of high quality. And with the Air 3S, you just send it up, take a few shots, long exposures, you'll probably nail them straight away and you can land it, happy days, and you've got great long exposure. So this is an absolute easy to use long exposure beast. Okay, so let's get into my top tips for creating long exposures with drones. And the first one is that you need to understand the relationship between movement and shutter speed. Long shutter speeds combined with a lot of movement will create the longest motion blur and light streaks. So as an example, if we take these pictures taken off Tower Bridge, we have one picture where there's a lot of traffic moving across it. So we've got this 5-second exposure, you get these nice long light streaks moving across it. But then shortly afterwards, again 5-second exposure, we've got another picture taken, and as you can see, because that traffic isn't moving much, you haven't got any light streaks and you've just got slightly blurry cars. So there's a relationship between the amount of movement and the shutter speed. Even at 8 seconds, if there isn't much movement in the scene, you won't get long light streaks or motion blur. By the same logic, if the drone is close to an object which is supposed to be stationary, such as a building or a tree or flagpole, any movement in the drone is going to cause unwanted motion blur, because motion blur is only supposed to be there in objects which are supposed to be moving. If it's there in objects which are stationary, then it looks unsightly and it'll ruin the shot. So it's worth remembering that, especially on windy days where that drone's going to be moving more, and then that perceived movement of close objects is going to be exaggerated. So it's worth avoiding that when you compose your shot. Okay, so here's a little trick that I use to check whether my long exposures are actually working. Now, while I'm taking that long exposure, if you look at the live view on your controller, it's going to freeze during that exposure. So if it's 8 seconds, your live view is going to freeze and not move at all. Now, during that point, focus on a particular point on your screen, maybe line it up with your crosshair or rule of third guidelines. And when the live view returns to being live, see if there's a sudden jump in movement. If there isn't, you can be assured that your picture is nice and sharp. If there is, chances are that you've had some movement during that exposure and your shot's going to be blurry. Now, if you take repeated shots and every one of those shots has a lot of movement in it, what I'd then do is I'd go back and go to my next recommendation, which is to recalibrate your compass and check that that's working properly. If that doesn't work, try moving the drone on the yaw axis by a tiny, tiny bit. We're talking like a fraction of a degree. Sometimes I find that can just get the drone on a more locked position on the yaw axis, and I don't know why it does that, but maybe it's just due to the compass just being more comfortable being in a certain orientation. It's also worth remembering that even though quite often you'll take pictures at night, the more lit up and the more ambient light sources you have in that scene, so like a cityscape like London obviously has a lot of ambient light, that allows the stabilization, the camera stabilization, to work more effectively with these kind of drones and more effectively keeps your image stable. The other thing that's almost essential for taking long exposures with drones, especially the Air 3S, is ND filters, because the Air 3S has no variable aperture, and as such, the only other way you can restrict the amount of light going through to your sensor, other than shutter speed, which we're trying to control and set to what we want, is by fitting an ND filter. Now, for city nightscapes like London, you can get up to about 1 second exposure without an ND filter. With an ND8 filter, which comes with the ND filter set that's supplied with the Flymore packages, you can get up to about 3 to 5 seconds, depending on the amount of ambient light that's available. So if you're in a very lit up area, you can get up to about 3 seconds. Anything more is going to get overexposed. If you're somewhere more rural with less light sources, you can probably do 5 or 6 seconds. Anything more than that, so if you want to use the full capacity of this drone's long exposures, which can go up to 8 seconds and work very well at 8 seconds, you need something like an ND16 filter. Now, the filter set that's supplied with the Air 3S Fly More packages has an ND8, ND32 and ND128 filter, which is quite spread out, and it's a nice range, but it's got some big gaps in it, and you can fill those gaps by going up in ND filters and then in cranking up the ISO. But ideally you want something like an ND16 filter to give you an 8-second exposure with this drone. Now, fortunately, Freewell did send me a set of their split ND filters for the Air 3S for review, and this one does come with an ND16 as well as an ND64. So if you combine this with the filters that come with the Air 3S Fly More sets, you've basically got the full plethora of ND filters that you'd ever need, apart from stupidly high ND numbers like ND1000. It's a bit of a shame that they didn't supply an ND8 with it, but other than that, this is very comprehensive and all you need. The design's great, their metal filters fit fantastically, and best of all, the case has been changed from the magnetic ones that they did for the Mavic 3 Pro previously, which I've got here. Magnetic cases are a bit 2020. And well, you can see their filters kind of have a tendency to fall out because they're not fitted very well. And I do like a good filter case, and I much prefer this one here. So that's great, and the filters work really, really well. You can get away with an ND32 if you have to, so don't feel that you have to buy this set in order to do 8-second exposures. But I just find keeping your ISO low and using the right ND filter without blacking out too much light is not a bad idea with the Air 3S, so I would recommend getting an ND16 at the very least. If you are interested in buying the Freewell ND filters, there's an affiliate link in the description below, and if you buy through that, you'll be sponsoring a portion of my next coffee, which is a very good cause. The last tip I've got is just to get experimenting and get creative, because the fun doesn't have to end with nightscapes and long light streaks. For example, if you take pictures at dawn or dusk where the light's starting to drop down a little bit, even an ND128 filter is going to be more than enough to crank up your shutter speed to 4 or 8 seconds, and you can create some really cool effects. So for example, these pictures were taken on a very dull day, very overcast in Brighton. It was quite tough to really get a stunning picture, but just using long exposures, you could create that sort of motion on this carousel here, or creating a perceived motion on this moving platform. Or here's another case where I've used long exposures in daytime to iron out the texture of waves and kind of give you more of an ethereal fine art type look of this derelict burnt out pier in Brighton. Kind of gives it more of like a moody look and gives it more character. And then have a look at this last example. So this is actually made with the 3x camera, so 72mm, and it's 2 images which have been manually stitched together into a panorama, and they're both 8-second exposures. And look at this, we've got these nice long light streaks going all the way into the distance. We've got motion blur on this viewing platform. We've got sharp overall image with detail on the shadows. The image is stitched together nicely. And even on a dull day like this, you're able to create something which is actually quite interesting and a bit unusual. So taking long exposures with the Air 3S is just a pure joy because it's so capable. If you haven't done it before, I'd highly recommend it because I think you'd be very pleased with the results. So let's talk about hyperlapses. Now, the Air 3S has a built-in hyperlapse function, and that works okay to an extent. I mean, it's not bad, but it's not amazing. The problem is that the exposure time is limited. So at 2-second intervals, the maximum exposure you can take is 1/3 of a second. And the problem is, at 1/3 of a second, the results look a bit like this, which is okay, but quite stuttery and a bit amateurish and not as good as they could be. So I'm going to show you step by step how we used to do it back in the day before DJI treated us to automatic hyperlapse functions, because by doing it the manual way or the old school way, we can use longer exposure times and create a more interesting look by having longer light streaks, more motion blur, and just generally a more dreamy, interesting hyperlapse look. So first of all, let's go out and capture some footage. First of all, select JPEGs because RAW images are going to take too much space, and for this kind of shooting that's unnecessary, but you can use RAWs if you want to do heavy processing on your images. Next, ensure that you're in manual shooting mode and choose the longest shutter speed that's permittable by the intervals you'll be taking. So in my case, I'll be doing 3-second intervals where the maximum shutter speed is 2 seconds. But then take a test shot and have a look at that shot and ensure that you're happy with the results with the overall exposure, the light streaks, and the composition. You then want to go to one of your automated flight modes, such as waypoints or point of interest. Set this up in the way that you intend to do your hyperlapse. And once you've done that, what I do is choose a fast global speed and just do a trial run of that automated flight path, just to see what the Hyperlapse is going to look like, or to give you a preview of the look that you're going to get in normal speed. Once you're happy with your preview, you're ready to start the actual Hyperlapse capture. So for whatever automated flight mode you're using, so in my case it's waypoints, choose the slowest global speed you can get away with, because I find that just gives you the nicest, sort of dreamiest kind of look in the end. But if for whatever reason you want something a bit faster, then obviously choose the speed that you want. Then go to timed shots and choose the slowest intervals that's available for your chosen shutter speed. So in my case, I'm using 2-second shutter speeds, and the slowest intervals for that is 3-second intervals. Get ready, and once your flight path starts, you want to start your capture. It doesn't matter if you're 1 or 2 frames out, because you can always exclude them when you edit later. Hyperlapses can take a long time to capture, so grab yourself a coffee, tea or a can of beer and sit back, relax and wait while your Hyperlapse is being captured. Okay, so once you've transferred your images to your computer, the first thing I'd do is rename them into something which has an ascending numerical order. So in this case, I'm just going to highlight them, right click, rename, and then there you go, we've got Ashford 3 underscore, and that'll give you an example of what it'll be. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's a reason for that, which I'll explain in a minute. So we'll click rename, and it's going to rename all the files, starting with _1 all the way up to _417. Then we're going to open Adobe Premiere and start a new project. The next thing I normally do is create a sequence. Okay, so the next part is the important bit. So this is where we import the images that we created. So I right click on this and click import. And what you'll have is your bunch of images that you created and renamed. Now, if you click on the first image and click on show options, what you see down here is this little image sequence checkbox. If that checkbox isn't available, it'll be because of your file name not making any numerical sense and it not being able to interpret it. So that's why I normally rename them into this kind of format, because it just negates that. In some cases, depending on how you capture the images, it might be fine, but just to be sure, or if it's grayed out and you can't select it, if you rename them into something which makes numerical sense, then it'll work. So we'll click that box. Then when you import it, it'll import the images as an actual video sequence as opposed to 417 individual images. Now, it's worth adding at this stage that you could have edited the images as individual stills, copied settings across and all that before converting into a sequence, or you can do it this way where you convert it into a sequence and then adjust colors in Premiere afterwards. So next we're going to drag and drop that file onto our sequence, which gives us an unstabilized sort of raw version of that Hyperlapse. Then go into Effects and type Warp Stabilizer and drag that effect onto the footage. Now, the Warp Stabilizer has a few settings that you can change. The default settings should work quite well, but you can change the smoothness, so it's 50% by default, which works quite well. Subspace warp, stabilize, crop, and auto scale is what you want, so that'll move in and out. After a short while, that's going to finish stabilizing, and unless you've got a very fast computer, I'd say it's worth rendering that section in and out. And as easy as that, you've got your Hyperlapse complete with long light streaks, fully stabilized, and looking much nicer than the alternative out of the box. After that, you might just want to go to the Lumetri color panel, make some fine little tweaks to it, and you've got your Hyperlapse all done and dusted. Anyway, that's the end of this video, and I hope you found it useful and enjoyable in giving you some insights into how good the Air 3S is at long exposures. It's definitely fired me up to do a lot more of this kind of photography, and hopefully it's inspired some of you to give it a go as well. Until the next time, happy flying, stay safe, keep trying new things, and I'll see you soon. Bye bye.